My name is Mark Hansen. I am a professor here at Clembia Journalism School. I lead something called the براون Institute.
Hi, I'm Dرومیل Mehta. I'm an associate professor of journalism at the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. I'm also deputy director of the Tao Center for Digital Journalism and a visiting professor at the Harvard Kennedy School.
The براون Institute was established about 10 years ago. Helen Gurley Brown, who was the longtime editor of Cosmopolitan magazine, gave a gift that established the Institute. It was in honor of her husband, David Brown, who was a movie producer. And he went to both Stanford and Columbia. And so the Institute spans both coasts. And our mission is to look at the interplay between technology and journalism, how technology will shape the practice of journalism, and how concerns of journalism might affect the priorities for engineering.
I did my undergraduate at Northwestern University. I was a philosophy major. I also did a master's in computer science. I'd met some journalists at Northwestern at the time, and I thought, you know who's cool? Those journalist folks were interesting. I attended a conference, the National Institute for Computer Assisted Reporting, or NICAR, and that's where I got to really know a bunch of data journalists and eventually fell into a role at 538 as a data journalist. I had an editor at 538 who once described computational journalism as quantitative social science on deadline. And I really loved that framing. He was an economist, so it makes sense that he sees it through the lens of quantitative social science. But you know, is there anything fundamentally different about what we do as journalists versus what a quantitative social scientist does? And I would argue that we're both trying to get at the truth. With the quantitative skills that I have, when I'm interviewing experts, the nature of the interview sort of changes in that you are kind of a participant in the research, right? Like you have the data, and so instead of just asking them questions of their research and then taking those answers to other experts, you can also analyze the data yourself. You can show them your findings. You can say, hey, I analyzed this data and this is what I found. What do you think? How does this square with what you found? And so it's a different kind of interview that you can have once you have some of these quantitative skills.
I'm not a journalist by training. I'm a statistician. That's where my doctorate sits. I've been in the journalism school, though, for 10 years now, teaching something called computational journalism. Computational journalism, the computation in it means that we use computation as a tool for reporting. So as a way to kind of partner with statistics, to partner with data, to tell us something about the world around us. There's a flip to that, though. Computational journalism, in my mind, is also about reporting on computation, not just with. So having enough understanding about how systems work. A lot of our world is driven by data and computation, and understanding those processes, reporting on those processes, deciding if those processes are fair or not. That feels like the purview of a journalist. So we need to teach journalists a bit about computation, not only to have more access to kind of the data society that we live in, but also to report on the societal effects of computation.
I think it's a little bit like trying to define investigative journalism, right? And like, how is that different from traditional journalism? And in some ways it is, and in some ways it's not, right? And I think computational journalism works the same way. Computation and data are another tool in your journalistic arsenal, but is it fundamentally different from other kinds of journalism? I would argue not necessarily, right? We're looking for the truth. We're trying to tell those stories. We're trying to tell them in an accurate, compelling, engaging way to the readers. And we're using computational tools in order to do that. So that may involve data analysis. It may involve some kind of algorithm. It may involve a new tool or an app. It may involve coding, building your own software. But at the end of the day, the journalistic goals are still the same.
If the process of reporting is about being alert to and curious about the world around us, then computational or data journalism extends that curiosity and that attention into the virtual, right? Into systems of data, into computational systems in one way or another. And it calls for a degree of creativity that I think is baked into journalism, the journalism practice as it is. The data that we choose to render lived experience, right? Those choices that we make, the ways in which we choose to visualize, the ways in which we choose to process, the summary statistics, everything that we do with data in one form or another is a kind of creative act.
I'm often asked, do data journalists start with the data and then get to the story, or do you start with a question and then go find it in the data? And the answer is it really goes both ways. So some some stories that we work on, we have a question, like, for example, how many times have police shot civilians in the US, right? And then you go searching for that data and you try to figure out, does it exist? What is the quality of the data? What is known, what is not known? What are the caveats? How can we tell the story with that data set? Sometimes the data set exists, sometimes it doesn't, right? So sometimes you have to file a Freedom of Information request to get it if it exists within the government. Oftentimes it doesn't exist at all, in which case we may start a data collection effort to try to figure out how we can best obtain this data. And so sometimes we start with a burning question like that and we go and try to find the data. Sometimes the opposite happens, right? So the 2020 census comes out and there's just this big new data set, and the question is, what's new? What has changed in America since the last time a big census was conducted? And so we go digging around in that data looking for what the stories might be.
My favorite piece had to do with the 2020 census. There was a move within the Census Bureau, or a concern within the Census Bureau, that people's privacy could be violated. So you can imagine the census being a big table that has your name and address and then the questions that you've answered, like how old you are and race, ethnicity, what have you, right? When the census creates the data that it publishes, it takes your name and address away and replaces the address with the block that you're part of, and then it'll start to make aggregates. How many people, how many white guys of my age live in this block, and they give you counts. And it publishes millions and millions and millions of these aggregate numbers. In fact, it publishes so many aggregate numbers that it's possible to take those aggregates and go backwards to the original table. Every aggregate is a constraint on that table, because we now know that there are this many white guys of this age living in this block, and that's a constraint. It turns out that it's feasible to kind of invert this and, like I said, create the whole person level table. And then it is possible to use things like age and block and gender as a key to bring back to other databases and start to combine things, right? And so the Bureau decided that because you can do this sort of inversion, they need to do some privacy protection. They've always done a little privacy protection. They would swap people out. So if you were the only person, the only 80-year-old living on your block, they might swap you out with another family or another person. Usually they'd swap families, so you and your family would go somewhere else to a different block, and then a person would come in that had different, had characteristics that matched a little bit more, so that you didn't stick out. Because if you really were the only 80-year-old on your block, then suddenly somebody looking through the table, the aggregate tables, would see a place where there's only one 80-something-year-old, and then they would learn other things about you. What the Bureau decided was that swapping wasn't doing what it needed to do. And so they implemented something called differential privacy, which is a whole other thing. But I wrote a lovely story about about differential privacy and what that was going to mean. And it started with a statistics PhD student and I implementing that attack. We did the inversion, created the person level table, just to show that it was doable. And so we did it for Manhattan, and got to interview people from the Bureau and differential privacy experts and so on. It was beautiful. It was the dorkiest thing possible, right? But it was a beautiful story that I didn't think was going to get written otherwise.
The world is increasingly data-driven. A lot of the work that we do, but also that politicians, government actors, corporations do, have some kind of data footprint. And we can look at that data footprint to better understand what's going on, or to better get at the truth that we want to tell in our stories. Or data and computation, I think, is more and more becoming a core competency of a journalist. So, for example, during the COVID pandemic, we have all of this talk of flattening the curve, and constantly there are these statistics coming out. We're talking about the rate of reproduction of a disease. I think your average journalist needs to take that information and help the reader, help the public understand how this impacts them, and that requires a new level of statistical literacy that I think all journalists should be striving for.
People outside of Columbia can get access to the work here. I think all of the data faculty have GitHub repos that you can have a look at. Uniformly, we use some form of notebook for teaching. They're easily shared. someone can grab a copy of it and start to walk through it. And again, because it's a combination of code and text, they're well documented. So the lessons that I teach are always well documented. There's a large number of videos of various kinds online that attempt to teach people coding. There are conferences for data and computational journalism like Nigari that have workshops that people can go to and learn more. There are lots of mailing lists that you can sign up for, Slack channels you can join that host exceptionally generous journalists who will help you and point you to tools.
There's a Slack channel called News Nerdery where people who work in this field, in order for them to interact with each other, what we call ourselves news nerds, right? Those of us who work in news but are sort of computation or quantitative adjacent. Nigari, the organization that I'd mentioned earlier, they have an email list called Nigari, and so there's just emails from data journalists from all over. Then there's trainings run by organizations like Pointer and ICIJ, and there's sort of these data journalism trainings that are offered, often online as well. And then of course, if you're really into this stuff, you can pursue further education in data journalism. Computation is really one more tool in your toolkit, and so as you sort of learn how to code, it's easy to start slowly disappearing behind your computer screen, and it's just so important to continue to be in touch with the community, continue to do reporting, continue to find the people that are affected, continue to interview the people in sort of levers of power, but you have sort of a new way to approach these conversations with the new tools that data gives you.